Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on History by Podcast. Today I'm joined by Gary Greenberg, author of 101 Myths of the Bible. And today we're going to be talking about 32 out of 101 Myths of the Bible. So welcome back to the show, Gary.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Always a good show.
Yeah, great to have you back with us. So here's this book, everybody, 101 Myths of the Bible. And if you have not seen the previous part and you're watching this, it'd probably be good to watch the first part, at least to understand the documentary hypothesis. We cover what that's about, because we're going to be going over some of those sources, because they're going to be mentioned sometimes during this program, but not all the time. So that being said, 101 Myths of the Bible, there it is. You can check out the History Valley Amazon affiliate, link to go purchase your copy of the book. So let's begin with Myth 11. God created man and woman in his own image. So you point out here that the word Adam probably doesn't mean what it has been assumed to mean, because Adam is interpreted to mean man, but there is a Hebrew word for man called Ish. So what is the deal with that?
Well, it's even more interesting because they don't call him Adam and first. They call him the Adam, meaning he's a creature of some sort, rather than a person, or at least a personal name. He doesn't become Adam as a person with the name Adam until Genesis 5, when they start doing the chronological listings of the patriarchs. And the reason what we have here is, and if you'll notice, this Adam, the Adam, was created male and female. So again, it's not a normal human being. The reason for that is that we're talking initially about what was originally the Egyptian god Adam, Atum in normal spelling, who was the creator deity in the city of Heliopolis, which was the oldest, just about the oldest major city in Egypt, at least as an intellectual center. It goes back before 3000 BC. Heliopolis is the Greek name meaning sun city. It's actually called Anu in Egypt, and in the Bible, the name appears as On, O-N. So we have the Adam, male and female. And in the Egyptian myth, the Adam is a singular creative entity who in some manner produces a male and a female offspring. So basically, this is a creature that in some sense has a male and female characteristic in the Egyptian context. So that's what we're dealing with here in this part of the story. The Adam is not the typical human being. Because of the confusion using Adam as a name and later in Genesis 5, and the similarity of the word Adam in Hebrew to the word for dust or red or ground or red clay. The biblical editors apparently got confused and left this artifact of the original polytheistic context for the creation stories.
And here's another continuation of Myth 11, so everybody can see the some more parallels here between Egyptian myth and the creation myth in the book of Genesis. And you point out that Atum is similar to Adam, as we were talking about earlier. Now,
Mm.
how did he become? How did he go from being a god to being the first man? What
Okay,
do
what you have, well, first of all, they're created in different contexts. Uh, the first story in Genesis 1 basically is from the P source. The second story about the Garden of Eden and so forth comes from the J source. When we get a little closer to that, I'll show you the link between the two stories and how they've been overlooked. So basically, you have, in the first story, man and woman, theoretically, this Ha-Adam, the male-female character, came to be thought of as the human race or people or the individuals or whatever. And when they got the similarities, brought it to the word for dust, created a biblical context separate from the origins. But what happened is that the earlier Egyptian myths got lost in history, in the biblical history. I mean, they weren't writing until well over, hundreds of years after the events of the Exodus, assuming you accept an Exodus in some reasonable time frame. And in Genesis 1, the Adam appears theoretically on the sixth day. And in Genesis 2, we have Adam, but that Adam is different from the one in Genesis 1. That one is more human-like and very significantly different. There's a big gap between the creation of Adam, the male, and the person called the female, who eventually becomes Eve, but is not initially known as Eve. So you have Genesis 2 with an Adam who's a human-like character separate from Eve, and Genesis 1 with a singular character that's male and female. In neither case are they really Adam yet. In Genesis 5, you finally get the first usage, basically, of the name Adam as a personal name. He's initially the man or the Adam and so forth. This was fairly problematic for biblical scribes, historians, and everyone throughout history, because it's almost universally accepted among scholars that the Genesis 2 is a second creation story, and it has a lot of differences, including chronology, from the first creation story. And it takes a lot of theological lifting yourself by a bootstrap sort of way to figure out a way to make Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 work together. But basically, you're dealing with three different Adams in the context, and that's hard, and it was confusing. They just didn't get it.
So now we're at myth 12. God created Adam and Eve on the sixth day.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about here. On the sixth day, in which I actually argue it was the seventh day, but we don't have to get too deeply into that. So here we have the Adam on the sixth day. This is the P source. And, this is your introduction, I think. Create him in his own image, if you look at it. And he created the male and he created the Adam in his own image. male and female. The image is of the god Adam, the Egyptian god Adam, who is basically unifying male and female characteristics so that he can procreate the next generation of entities.
So why do you think it was put on the 6th day if it was originally the 7th day?
Well, it's a little tricky to follow, and I'm not sure it's important, but what happened was there were a couple of typos of sorts. Generally, at the end of each day, God blesses the events that took place on that day. But one day they miss, and on another day they do it twice. On the 6th day, there are 2 blessings. So conceptually, the first blessing ends one day, which would have been the 6th day, and the next blessing blesses man, or the Adam, on what should be the 7th day, with God potentially resting on the 8th day rather than the 7th day. But they got into the idea of a 7-day creation, so they had to squeeze some things together.
All right, myth 13. God gave man dominion over the creatures.
Okay, let me just see where we're at.
Right there. I'm going to fix that.
Right. After, you start going through the creation process, different events happen on different dates. The sequence isn't entirely original necessarily. Days 3 through 5 may have been tampered with in some way or another. Partially because of the later appearance in Babylonia after the conquest of Judah by Babylon, and a lot of Babylonian influences started to come in. But the basic Egyptian stuff is still underlying the whole sequence.
So it seems like to me that what you're describing here is instances where the original Hebrew creation myth was edited and redacted as it came into contact with Mesopotamian myth, hence the changes you're talking about.
There were changes instituted by the Babylonian period, and the Israelites and the Hebrews, Israel, Judah, and everything, lost literary contact with the Egyptian sources. They know after a certain point of time, by the time the Bible was being written, they no longer knew that these were Egyptian sources, but they were just reworking the data. But there were 2 tricks they used to try to redact the texts. In the first creation story, the peace source, they took the Egyptian deities and stripped out the character, but left the characteristic. So you have heaven and earth, but you don't have the deity of heaven and deity of earth. In Genesis 2, where you get the second creation story, they kept the personality of the deities, but got rid of the characteristics. So you have more human-like characters in Genesis 2, but they're not holding directly the Egyptian deity characteristics. So Genesis 1 has the characteristics of the god, but no humans being portrayed, or no deities being portrayed, while in Genesis 2, you have the deities being portrayed as humans, but the characteristics have been stripped away. So Genesis 2 really integrates with Genesis 1 in a lot of ways when you get back to the Egyptian sources.
So myth 14, God created earth on the third day.
Right. This is one of the places where there's a problem. Let me just look at my copy for a moment so I get it right. Okay. On the third day, God is basically separating the waters from the ocean. Basically, in day 2, if you'll remember, I described the mountain coming out of the primeval ocean in the Egyptian creation myths, and the mountain was converted into a firmament holding up the heaven and the earth. On the third day, they're separating the dry land from the waters that surround the mountain. And here you run into several problems. In the story, I think they claim that the land was all gathered into one. The waters were all gathered together in one place, but that doesn't make a lot of sense because they don't tell you what that place is. They do talk about. I don't know if I did this in 1 or 2. Hold on. And then you have an indication. Yeah, at the end of day 2, there's no blessing for the separation, for the creation of heaven and earth. In day 3, I think they have a blessing, and they're bringing, and that day 2 and day 3 were originally the same day. And that's one of the issues. So you have the mountain rising out of the waters, and then the dry land separating from the oceans.
Myth 15, God rested on the seventh day.
Right. I think I discussed that a little bit.
Yeah,
but there's a problem there. It says that God finished the work on the seventh day. He actually did some work on the seventh day, and then he rested. So the story is sort of used to say we rest on the seventh day because God rested, but God didn't actually rest on the seventh day. He did some additional work. And originally this would have been the 8th day, and the 7th day would have been the day on which he created the atom.
So why do you think they decided to squeeze God's rest and his final workday all into the same day, the seventh day?
Later in biblical history and in Judah history, they're exposed to kind of 7-day weeks, and they start using 7-day weeks. But when you look at the reason for the Sabbath, it changes. There are 3 different explanations, I think, in the Torah about why we have a Sabbath. At one place they tell us it's to remember and commemorate the release from slavery in Egypt. Second one tells us God rested. And then there's a third one about protecting the animals. There were no clear rules and regulations here, but basically they came to the idea of a 7-day week. And so they had to squeeze the creation into a 7-day period. And some influences came from Babylon on that, others from the Canaanite period, and then there were numerical periods where in culture where they considered the number 7 a lucky day. So there's a number of things going on there.
All right, let's get to myth 16. God rested after the creation.
Right. I was talking about that. And let's see if I have the passage here. It says, on the 7th day, God ended his work, which he had made, and then he rested. So there's some indications. You can interpret this to indicate that God actually was doing some work on the 7th day, and then he rested. There's an interesting passage in the Gospel of John that may be reflecting that passage. In John 5, Jesus is accused of violating the Sabbath laws, and Jesus said he was doing the Father's work. And the implication here is that God may have been working on the 7th day, so Jesus can work on the 7th day also. And that may be a callback to this passage.
Myth 17, the heavens and the earth had children.
Okay, now this is really, I think, one of the more fascinating passages in much of the early part of Genesis. If you read it carefully, it's talking about the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created. This is a formulaic phrase. These are the generations of. There's actually 10 occasions where that phrase appears in Genesis, and one other book where the phrase appears. In every other one of the cases, it's an indication that you're about to get stories about families and people, the generations of Isaac, the generations of Jacob. In every instance, it's referring to stories about families. Here, biblical scholars refuse to accept that. It says, these are the generations of the heaven and the earth. As I told you earlier, in Genesis 1, in its transition, they were stripping the characteristics of the deity away from the deity. So what this passage originally represents is the deities, heaven and the deity earth, had a family, and these are the stories of the family that you're about to get. This is basically the transition to Genesis 2 creation story. You're going from Genesis 1 now to the story of Genesis 2, and these are really the deities in Genesis 2, but the deities have been stripped out, leaving just the personifications, the images of the deities, the people who were in the Garden of Eden, Cain, Abel, Adam, Eve, and so on. And more importantly, it also says this happened on the day when they were created, in the day that God made the heavens and the earth. So what this is actually saying is these stories about the children of heaven and earth took place on the second day of creation. This is a callback to the first story, but the second story here is the J source, and a lot of editing has gone on through J. So basically, the stories we're getting about the transition to Genesis 2 and the Garden of Eden and so on really are about things that happened on the second day of creation in Genesis 1 and in the Egyptian creation myths about heaven and earth.
Myth 18, Adam and Eve were the first humans.
Right, that's the myth. But as I explained, Adam and Eve were originally a male and female integration. In Genesis 2, they provide on what would originally have been the second day of creation, Adam and Eve in the formation of humans. But the biblical scholarship is that the sixth day is the creation of humanity. But that's wrong. It's the second day where the humans appear, but it's transitioned into the J source. So they try to break it away.
Now we're at myth 19, God formed Adam from the dust of the earth.
Just give me a moment. Okay.
Yeah, you note additional parallels between the Adam and Eve story and...
Yeah. The word for the dust and basically red, the word red, and they transform it sort of into red clay and dust and so on, was thought to be the origin of humanity. And here we're in Genesis 2 now, and God is creating Adam separately from Eve. We're now getting a creation of Adam and Eve that's very different from the one in Genesis 1, where they were integrated as a single entity, male and female. Now Adam is created, but not Eve. So this Adam is not a female integration. He's solely male. But to get around that, they'll later produce Eve out of Adam, just as the Egyptian god produced male and females out of himself without having a female to procreate with.
Now we're at myth 20, God planted a tree of life and a tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Right. Now, as I've been explaining, Genesis 2 and the Garden of Eden story take the elements of the Egyptian gods and separate them from the Egyptian gods. In the Egyptian creation myth, we have a different version of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam, the Egyptian god, creates two children, a Shu and Tefnut. And they are male and a female, and he creates them. And in some of the Egyptian texts, Shu is identified with eternity, and Tefnut is identified with moral order, what the Egyptians called ma'at. And in one of the texts, the flood in the form of the god Nun talks to Adam and tells him to eat Tefnut, who is moral order. So here is the complex that you have. You have knowledge, and you have eternity, and you have the eating of one of them. And that's the Egyptian story. They have taken the gods out of the story and transformed the god Shu into the tree of life and transformed Tefnut into the tree of knowledge of good and evil, moral order. And then you get into the problem of what these trees signify and how they're going to be used in the story.
Did they take the tree of knowledge story entirely from Egypt, or did they combine
Yes.
it all? Okay.
Yes, they didn't actually have a tree in the Egyptian story. They transformed it into trees in the garden, which is where Shu and Tefnut would have been. But heaven and earth hadn't quite been created yet at the time of this story in the Egyptian texts. Shu and Tefnut give birth to heaven and earth in the Egyptian creation myths. So the two deities associated with the tree of life and the tree of knowledge give birth to heaven and earth. But they don't start out as separate entities. We have an Egyptian story that tells us that the creator deity, Ra, ordered heaven and earth not to couple, to get together. But they disregarded that order and did couple, giving birth to 5 children eventually, but they were punished for violating the order. And at first, the goddess Nut couldn't give birth. There's a story as to why she was subsequently able to. But these elements are transferred over into the Garden of Eden story.
And this is a depiction of Atum as a
Right.
cat.
In the Egyptian imagery, the cat is the god Ra. Here's the serpent in the tree, and the god Ra punishing the serpent and hitting him in the head. However, in the Egyptian tradition, the serpent is the god Set, and the god Set killed his brother Osiris and had to be punished. And so in the Egyptian story, when the god Osiris becomes reanimated and lives, he punishes the serpent by bruising him in the head, which is what happens in the biblical stories eventually. All this is becoming condensed in the biblical stories.
Yeah, I meant to say that the cat is a depiction of Ra, but Ra and Atum were conflated, much like Set and
Right, both are sun deities, and they represented in Egyptian culture different parts of the sun's journey through the sky. And eventually Ra and Atum were integrated as a single deity known as Adam Ra. But they were a single deity that had one set of characteristics, but the separate characteristics of Adam and Ra remained with each.
So that takes us to myth 21. Adam would die if he ate from the tree of knowledge.
Right. And supposedly in the very day that he ate. And so that creates another problem, because after he ate from the tree of knowledge, he didn't die. He lived for probably over another 900 years. So what happened here is the biblical scribes were dealing with the original Egyptian story, as I told you, about eating. Adam was told by the primeval flood Nun to eat his daughter Tefnut in order to gain moral knowledge. And this didn't work well with the biblical scribes, so they had to rewrite the story and forbid the eating of moral knowledge, because they considered that integrating the polytheistic sources into the Bible.
In myth 22, God forbid Adam to eat certain fruit.
Right. And what's interesting to me here is they only forbid eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But there was a second tree, and that was the tree of life. And they don't eat from it, but I don't think they were forbidden from eating from it, which is kind of weird. But what we learn in the story is somehow the idea of knowing what moral order is, what good and evil is, was supposed to be a characteristic limited to God, and possibly, and these mysterious figures that God is talking to in the Garden of Eden when he's giving these orders. There's some sort of a God talking about us. These are the angels and other characters in the garden. So they know about moral order. They don't want humans to know about moral order, because that would make them gods. And then they become concerned that if they have moral order and then eat from the tree of life, they'll have eternal life and they'll be no different from the gods. And that's very upsetting to them. So they have to take them out of the Garden of Eden, so they can't eat the tree of life, and they get punished for eating and learning about moral order. And of course, they didn't know what moral order was at the time they ate from the tree. So they have a further contextual problem. How would they know that what they were doing was wrong? Although God said not to eat from it, what made it wrong? Why was it morally wrong? Since they hadn't yet learned what moral order was.
So now we're at the point in which we're seeing parallels and in which resulted in conflations. So the Enki and Ninhursag story.
Right. You're starting to see, you're beginning to see Babylonian myths and Sumerian myths, which were preserved in Babylon, creeping into the biblical text. And there was a Babylonian myth also about forbidden fruit and image and myths leading to penalties about giving birth and pain and other things. And so I talk a little bit about what that myth did in the book. And basically, there was a goddess who created multiple plants, each of which was going to be a god, and orders not to eat them. And one of the deities was curious as to what the plants tasted like and ate from it, and then began to suffer and had to be relieved and cured and healed. But they retain the deity characteristic. They don't talk about the deities particularly in the biblical story, the Babylonian deities, but they sort of have some overlay over the Egyptian stories. And remember, by this time, the biblical scribes have no idea that they have all these Egyptian stories in the Bible, or in their sources anyhow.
So essentially, by the time the Babylonian period comes around and they're making these changes, they've forgotten. It was forgotten that these
Right. They didn't have a lot of writing to preserve things, so there was not a lot of written transition to the writing of the Torah, which was coming much later in time, beginning around the 7th, 8th centuries probably, and much of it in the 6th century.
All right, myth 23, Eve came from Adam's rib, in which we get a little bit more parallels of Enki and Ninhursag again.
Right, you're getting some parallels from the Babylonian sources, and there is some puns in the story and some other things. But what's important is that they had to have a way to create humans. And so the scribes took that story and applied it to Adam. But basically, in the Egyptian myths, woman was created out of the primary god and came out of the primary god. So you're seeing the original parallel is woman came out of God. And in the Egyptian myth, they transformed it into a rib that came out of God.
So basically, they took Nenti and turned her into Eve, basically.
Yeah. Yes. Well, Nenti took Enki's rib and transformed it, took the rib out. But we also have another parallel that in the biblical story, the taking of Eve out of Adam. Well, she's not known as Eve yet, just as the woman. We're told that led to the reason why man and woman should be married. And in the Egyptian myths, you have a kind of a similar story in creation, that certain characters were created in the heaven and earth story so that they can be married.
Myth 24, Adam gained wisdom without immortality.
Right. He ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but he didn't eat tree of life. However, the real story has to do, here we see more of the Babylonian overlay about myths of a man named Adapa, who was a deity.
And myth 25, there were... Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
were you expanding on the previous slide? Did you want me to go back to it?
No, leave it as it is.
All right. So now we're at myth 25. There were other beings in the Garden of Eden before
Right,
that.
you have the text here. God is talking to somebody. He says, if we allow him, if we'll make him in our image, he might become as one of us. Who is the us? God is obviously talking to someone, having a conversation in some manner. Now, he may not be using language. We don't know. He may be mentally communicating to other deities. But the other deities are the polytheistic deities from the Egyptian myths. And they are, to a large extent, being eventually converted into angels. And the angel class is a level below God, but above humans. So we really don't have a purely monotheistic culture. The angels have been demoted and do God's bidding, but they're basically deities.
Now we're at myth 26. God planted a garden eastward in Eden.
Yeah, just give me a moment here. Okay. Originally, in the Egyptian myths, when the mountain arises out of the primeval ocean and flame appears, as I told you, there was flames. That was the first light in day one of creation. The Egyptians started to refer to the mountain and its rising as the Isle of Flames. Interestingly, when they kick Adam and Eve, or when God kicks Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden, he creates flames to keep them away from the garden. What you really have is a redaction in which originally the garden was surrounded by flame. It was originally the mountain, part of the mountain that came out. Land was created in and around it, and it was surrounded, and the flames were there. By the time the Bible was being redacted, they changed it to having an angel place a flaming sword, I think, in front of whatever the entrance was. And that would have been theoretically the only way you could get into the garden, would have been to get past those flames. So if we follow the oldest Egyptian creation tradition from the city of Heliopolis, which means, again, I'll repeat, city of the sun, that would locate the Garden of Eden in the city of Heliopolis. Although each of the cities having a creation story would locate the mountain that arose in their own city. But the Heliopolitan tradition was the oldest and the most influential. And as a matter of fact, in the Bible, Joseph was married to the daughter of the high priest of the city of Heliopolis. So he would have very well been, the theory is that if Joseph had Egyptian connections, although it's probably mythological, he should be familiar with all the great myths of Egypt. And two of his children would have been half Egyptian.
Can you expand on the four river flows is
Yeah,
benign.
this is a problematic story. Earlier, we're told that God, on I think the third day it was, brought all the waters together in one place. Well, where's the one place that would have been known as the one place where all the waters gathered? Two of the river branches in the story are south of Egypt and Ethiopia. The other two are north in Mesopotamia, in the Tigris and the Euphrates, basically, forming a delta of sorts in Mesopotamia. That's what Mesopotamia is, the two rivers between the land between the rivers. That's what it means. But how is that part of the one water? How do those two rivers in Mesopotamia and two rivers south of Egypt constitute the waters in one place? The only place that Egyptians would have thought of as the one place where all the waters gathered, the River, and that's not mentioned in the story. And the big thing about the Nile River is that every year it overflows its banks and floods large parts of Egypt. This is how the Egyptian soil becomes fertilized. And then after a while, the waters withdraw back into the banks of the Nile. That's the one place where the waters are gathered. Every year it overflows and then gathers back together in the river. And that's why Egypt was one of the most fertile, productive countries in the Middle East. That's why it was almost the breadbasket of the Middle East, the fertility of the land based on the overflowing water. And the Egyptian creation stories mimic that. You have the Great Flood, which represents the Nile overflowing the land. And then when it withdraws, the land emerges out of the flood and creates piles of mud, which came to be identified with the mountain. So really, the Tree of Life would have been in Heliopolis. And the Garden of Eden would have been in Heliopolis.
Myth 27, Adam and Eve lived a simple, primitive lifestyle while in the Garden of Eden.
Yes. Let's take a closer look here. Yeah, this is another Mesopotamian overlay, Sumerian, Babylonian overlay, based on some myths about the life that people lived. Basically interesting in the Babylonian stories somewhere, they basically think of the humans as sort of slaves that should serve the gods. So they have to work and carry out things and do tasks. And so those are the tasks being assigned to basically Adam and Eve.
Myth 28, the serpent was more subtle than any beast.
Yeah, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, when I discussed it with you, remember the image, the picture? As I explained, heaven and earth had three children, Osiris, Set. Adam and Eve had three children, Seth, Cain, Abel, and Seth. In Egypt, Seth and Horus Well, initially, Seth and Osiris were rivals. Seth killed Osiris. Osiris was reanimated and became the god of life, god of the afterlife, and he punished the serpent, and we saw that in the picture somewhat, Seth being punished. Then Seth and Horus became rivals to be king of Egypt. So some of the details fade out in the biblical story, but the three children of Cain and Abel were originally the three children of heaven and earth. If you'll remember, we were being told in the introduction to this sequence that these are the stories of the generations of heaven and earth. Who are the generations? The children of the gods Geb and Nut, the Egyptian gods of heaven and earth, and those children were Osiris, Seth, and Horus, and then there were two female deities, Isis, who was married to Osiris, and a third deity who was married basically to Seth. So Horus and Seth then became rivals, and Seth did everything he could to try to overthrow Horus's reign. And we actually have numerous texts that give us passages about the rivalry and one full story about the rivalry between them, where Horus actually outthinks Seth all the time. So we have a transition from Seth being the clever one to where Horus was originally the clever one. They put it with Seth and then punish him.
And so basically, this is the result of the conflation between Apophis and Set that we talked a little bit about earlier.
Right. Seth and Apophis were
Yeah.
were eventually thought of as the same deity, although originally they were separate. Apophis was a serpent on the underworld, and Ra was the king of the above. And every day Ra would make a journey in his boat through the underworld. And Seth originally was his protector in the underworld and protected Ra against Apophis. Sometime around 1000 BCE, that changed. Seth became a more negative character and became associated as Apophis, and became the rival of Ra. So Ra, or Seth as Apophis, was the enemy of God, and that's what we see in the Garden of Eden. The god Seth as Apophis, as a rival to Ra.
Verse 29, God punished Adam, Eve, and the serpent.
That's correct. Initially, God made it painful for Eve to give birth. She wouldn't have experienced pain in birth before that. So one of her punishments was that she would experience pain in birth. And Adam, I think, was required to bruise the serpent and punish the serpent and be his enemy for all time, be the enemy of the serpent. In the Egyptian mythology, as I mentioned above, the creative deity Ra, who was assimilated into Adam, orders heaven and earth, Geb and Nut, not to have intercourse. But they denied or they rejected that commandment. They had intercourse, and Nut became pregnant. So Ra declared that at no time of the year could Nut give birth. Now, the Egyptian year was initially 360 days, but it had 5 extra days. There's a myth as to how that happened. When the god Thoth learned about the punishment of Nut and that she couldn't give birth on any day of the year, he basically challenged the moon to a game of what they call drafts. So it could have been checkers, it could have been chess. It wouldn't have been chess, but it was some kind of a competitive board game. And he defeated Moon enough times to accumulate enough light to create 5 additional days. And since these days weren't part of the year, the Egyptian calendar had 360 days of 12 months. And he added 5 days to the Egyptian calendar, and Nut was able to give birth on each of those days. And she gave birth to her 5 children, 1 on each of the days. And the 5 children were Osiris, Seth, Horus, Isis, and Nephthys. The last 2 were females.
Myth 30, Cain killed Abel.
Yeah, this starts getting a lot more complicated. In the Egyptian myths, Osiris is assigned to the grain, to the area of agriculture. In the Cain and Abel story, Cain is the agricultural deity, or an agriculturalist, and his brother Abel is a shepherd. So we got overlap going on here between the Babylonian myths and the Canaanite and the Egyptian myths. In the Egyptian myth, Abel would have been the one who killed Cain. Cain would have been the older brother. Cain is the older brother. Seth is older than Horus. And Seth killed Horus in the Egyptian myth. Here we have some transference. There's an Egyptian myth with a shepherd and a farmer who grows things. And there was a competition between them with a goddess for her love based on who had the better contribution. And initially she was going to choose the farmer who had grain, but the shepherd talked her out of it. Now, in this part of the story, there's no death, but later the farmer is subject to persecution by demons who want to kill him, and he keeps trying to escape them, and he can't do it. And eventually he's put to death by the demons. And we have a detailed story about how that happened. The biblical account of how Cain killed Abel is missing, and it's very likely the Babylonian story about how the shepherd was killed. So we have now Cain has a lot of characteristics of Osiris, and that becomes, so we have to have a lot of changes going on. Cain was associated with agriculture. Osiris was associated with the agriculture, the learning of agriculture. Cain went around the world teaching the arts. Osiris went around the world teaching the arts. Cain built the first city. Osiris built the first city. Interestingly, one of the first cities in Babylon was called Fortress of the Smiths, the metal workers. Cain's name means smith. So we have a lot of indications that Cain was originally Osiris, but it's Osiris who gets killed by his younger brother, not his older brother. So we have the transference. They had to change things around, and they used the Babylonian myth to change things around.
And because they used the Babylonian myth, do you think that's probably the reason they don't have a son of the victim being born after his death to avenge him? That the Horus aspect is omitted.
Right. There is a third son, Seth, who originally would have been the god Seth, but they rearranged things. So we have actually in the Garden of Eden, Adam, who represents the Canaanite creator. You have Geb and Nut, who represent let me go back. Heliopolis. Adam is the creator god in Heliopolis, and Adam in the Garden of Eden represents that god. You have heaven and earth in the Garden of Eden with the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You have the three children of heaven and earth in the Garden of Eden, or basically born to heaven and earth. I think Seth is born outside. So basically the Garden of Eden is reiterating the Heliopolitan creation myths with some Babylonian overlays, and it all takes place on the third day of creation. Or actually the second day of creation and the third day, because that's the third day is when you start bringing in the plant life and other stuff.
A few minutes ago, you said something about Set killing Horus briefly. Did you mean Osiris when you said that?
He killed Osiris, right, because he wanted to be king of the god Egypt. But he tried to kill Horus. He just didn't succeed.
Right.
And we also have a myth.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So we got myth 31. Cain built a city east of Eden.
Right. And I spoke a little bit about that. He builds the first city. He's a craftsman. His children, his descendants are craftspeople. Just before the flood, some of his descendants are the creators of the various arts of music and crafting and smithing, which closely ties him to Osiris.
So now we're at myth 32. God sent a flood to destroy mankind.
Yeah. I think this is a relatively complicated area. The flood story, as it exists, is essentially the Hermopolitan flood myth, but it's going to get very complicated to get into. The ark on the flood has 4 males and 4 females. In the Hermopolitan flood myth, There are 4 males and 4 females who create the creator god, who is Ra. So basically, Noah's flood is originally a creation story from Hermopolis, but it's been transferred to a later time period and changed in context. But originally, it was the flood myth of Hermopolis, which is almost as old as Heliopolis and goes back before 3000 BC. So we really have 3 flood myths, 3 creation myths: Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and then Genesis 6, which is Noah's flood.
And you also get into the details about the 4 males and 4 females that
Right.
emerged in the primeval flood.
Yeah, I discussed that.
And yeah, but you also talk about where Noah, the name Noah, came from.
Right. Noah's name, interestingly, is 2 letters. The first letter is the letter N in Hebrew, and the Hebrew letter N is the word Nun, and it's represented by a serpent. In the Hermopolitan flood myth, one of the 4 males is named Nun, and I believe is represented by a serpent. So we're beginning to see how it was transferred from one culture to the other. It gets a lot more complicated down the line, so there's only so far we should probably go with the flood myths.
Yeah, we're at myth 33 now. Ham was the father of Canaan.
Right. So as I explained, the original myth is 4 males and 4 females, the primordial deities in Hermopolis who create the god Ra. And the god Ra in the myth is created as a child. And we have a kind of a strange story. So the biblical scribes go to great lengths to keep identifying Ham repeatedly as the father of Canaan. Canaan is the parallel in my telling to Ra, who was born from the 4 children. There was 4 children, 4 females who gave birth to Canaan, or who was Ra in my telling. So the scribes are saying, no. Ham was the father of Canaan. There was only one father. So there's clearly a translation, a redaction going on here where they probably had an original story with the 4 males on the ark being the father of Canaan. And then it gets very confusing later on when they describe Canaan as a brother of Ham rather than the father of Ham. So again, we're seeing a lot of mechanical things going on with the scribes to change the stories around.
Not myth 34. Noah released birds to determine if the land had.
Yeah. There's only so far I want to go with the flood story, but there's a couple of interesting things. You have an original Egyptian myth about the floods, and you have a Babylonian overlay on the floods, and it starts getting very complicated. But the raven is separate from the 3 doves that fly out from the ark. And the raven plays a separate role. So about all I want to say right now is that there's a mixture of two flood stories in Genesis. The P flood story, which has the raven, and is a longer flood story, which has details about the chronology, and the J story, which is the one about the doves. J brings more of the Babylonian story into the context. But what's interesting is if you follow the P flood story, it has a break between 300 and it ends with a break of 354 days and then an 11-day extension of the story. And this basically is Egyptian. What you have here is the lunar calendar of 354 days. That's how long the lunar calendar lasts. And an 11-day extension, which gives you the 365-day calendar, which is also an Egyptian calendar with no leap year. And the only people and the Egyptians also had a calendar of 354 days plus 11 days. So this is the Egyptian part of the flood myth, is an integration of all the Egyptian calendars. And the only people who had the 354 plus 11 calendar were the Egyptians. And the biblical scholars try to do a lot of backpedaling. And the raven, who somehow manages to fly around for several months without landing on anything, lands on the 354th day of the P flood myth. So that reinforces that we're talking about a 354-day period, and then there's an extension of the land drying out for 11 days.
Yeah, we're almost done with the flood myth. We have a few more slides left, and we'll be done. Myth 35: the flood occurred in the 10th generation of humanity.
Yeah, we're moving here to the Babylonian flood traditions. There's no fixed number, but one of the main flood myths in Babylon placed it around the 10th generation. In my telling, it's an original flood myth that begins in the beginning of creation. And I wrote a whole book about this stuff, so it's really not an easy way to slide right through it. But the 600th year plays an anchor role for working out the chronology within the flood myth. And I show how the J flood myth chronology can be integrated based on the time periods in J with the P flood myth that's much longer. I show basically that the J flood myth was really a myth about the Egyptian flood calendar, which was the first season of the Egyptian calendar, a 4-month period known as flood. And I show that the J flood lasted for the 120 days that make up the Egyptian flood season.
We're now at myth 36: all earthly life had become wicked and had to be destroyed.
Yeah, I think we have the Babylonian traditions here, mostly. The Babylonian flood was created by the gods because they were angry at mankind, allegedly because they were just too noisy and causing too much noise for the gods. I guess it was hard for them to go to sleep. And they decide to wipe out all of humanity with a flood. But there was one god who didn't want to see that happen. And he went to the hero of the Babylonian flood myth and helped him secretly escape the flood and create an ark that brought a lot of people on the ark along with animals and others. And that was used to repopulate Earth after the fact. There's a little brouhaha among the gods for this, but they repented for what they did, just as God repented for what he did.
Now we're at myth 37. The sons of God married the daughters of man.
Yeah, there's a lot of struggle in scholarship to figure out what this means. I'm not going to go into details. I describe it in more than one of my books on chronology. But my basic conclusion is that the sons of God, there was a period in Egyptian history between rival dynasties claiming to be the true dynasty, which ended in some sort of a marriage, possibly. And it's my contention that the sons of God were the pharaohs of Thebes, because all pharaohs were the sons of God. And the daughters of man were the daughters of the rival dynasty pharaohs. And eventually there was some sort of a resolution of the conflict with a marriage. And the rival dynasty faded out, and the Theban dynasty continued to take control of Egypt.
All right, we're at myth 38. Noah saved only 2 of each species.
Yeah, that's one version. Elsewhere, he saves 2 of each species, but also 7 of several species to use for sacrifice. And of course, in the J flood myth, there are 2, and in the P flood myth, you have an additional species surviving, the raven, who also survives the flood.
All right, myth 39. The rain lasted 40 days and 40 nights.
Right. There's a lot. This is a little too complicated to get into because it's hard to visualize through a lot of stories and passages. But you have different descriptions about what happened and how they integrate with the J and the P sources. There's disagreements about when it stopped, when it started, and so forth, and how long it lasted.
All right, let's get to myth 40. The flood covered the entire earth and all the mountains.
Yeah, basically their mountains, the flood did go that high. It was 15 cubits, I think, at its deepest, and that's not very tall, 25 feet.
All right, myth 41. After the flood, Noah sacrificed all the clean animals.
Yeah, if he had only brought 2 of each animal, there wouldn't have been anything to sacrifice. So there had to be additional animals to sacrifice.
All All right, we are at myth 42. All living creatures not on the ark perished.
Right, except that we have a species of giants in the Bible called the Nephilim, and somehow they survived the flood also. The rabbis were particularly concerned about that, and they created a legend that the Nephilim held on to the ark as the flood came around, and were able to survive by holding on to the ark. But that's not in the Bible.
All right, so that concludes the 32 myths. We covered from myth 11 all the way to myth 42. We left off
Busy
last
evening.
time at myth 10. So we're 42 myths in out of 101 myths. So thank you for joining me tonight, Gary.
Okay, take care.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.